This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. Welcome to another Patron Roundtable. I'll be your host, Russ Hugo, and I am honored to be joined tonight by Jessica Trevena and Cy James. Thank you both for joining us, and how are you doing this morning, evening, wherever you're at?
Wide awake and raring to go.
Mostly okay and winding down.
And to provide context for that statement, that question I asked, topic we're exploring here today is the international perspective, or international perspectives. Some, we can't obviously discuss them all, related to the X-Files. Jessica is going to be communicating the perspective from Australia, and Cy James from the United Kingdom, and specifically England. Mm-hmm. To start, even if you've already done the 5 questions of X, just to refresh or introduce to the listeners for this podcast really quickly, briefly introduce how you first came to the show, when it was, where you saw it, and your general impressions, and then how you became involved in fandom to any degree. We'll just go in order from east to west, so we'll start with Jessica.
Yeah, well, I started, for me, what was at the beginning, but it would have been slightly after the premiere in the US, because, Australia was behind the times, particularly in the early 90s. So I actually have recently discovered my diaries. So I know that the first episode I watched was the pilot on the 9th of August, 1994. And I loved science fiction. I was a big nerd. So it was pretty much, I was in straight away, and that was that.
Do you have any fun notes in that diary about your feelings of the pilot? Did you write any details of your impressions or anything?
I did. Most of them I would not read to anyone, let alone in public. But there is a couple of things. So one of the things I have here in front of me is, at first I thought it was going to be some boring murder mystery. Then the eerie introduction music started and I saw the X icon, and it was science fiction, mystery and sardonic humour all rolled into one. My absolutely favourite sort of genre. That's what 14-year-old me wrote.
It's so cool that you have that.
That's very good.
Have you listened to the other podcasts on the We Made This network, Giddy Carousel of Pop, by any chance?
No, I haven't.
It's one of my favorite podcasts. It's on the network. I recommend people check it out. It's about the magazine Smash Hits from England.
Uh-huh.
And
Wow.
I grew up in the United States, so I'm not familiar at all Smash Hits in general, except for the fact that I'm very much into English and UK pop, and even Australian pop and rock, new wave, etc. From that era. In particular, I'm always a big fan of the Pet Shop Boys, and Neil Tennant used to write for Smash Hits, so I knew of it. But that's a long tangent. Point being is I listened to it, and some of them have their diaries, and they read when the issue came out, what they were doing at that time. And it's so cool. Like, you have this incredible resource to connect. And again, I don't expect you to publish it, but maybe someday down the road, it could be a fun graphic novel.
Yeah, right. I remember that magazine, actually. We had that.
Oh, it's massive in the UK, or it was massive in the UK back then. It really was.
And Cy, how about you?
It's slightly after it premiered in the US. I think I remember the first time I watched it was the first episode that I watched was Deep Throat, and that was way back in, I believe it was 1994. Can't give you an exact date, but I remember watching it on a channel called Sky One over here, and it's since been shown on the terrestrial channels, BBC One or BBC Two, which again are the two mainstream channels over here. You kind of knew as well that when it was moved to prime time on BBC One that it's made it big in the UK, because anything that's shown on in prime time on BBC One is, going to get a huge following. Yeah, in a similar vein to Jessica, I had an interest in sci-fi pretty early, and this kind of, sort of solidified it, making it cool again, really. A lot of different things that I was drawn to, but I'm sure we'll get into discussing them over the course of this podcast. But that's what I can remember. I definitely remember it was Deep Throat, and I definitely remember it was sometime in 1994.
Well, that's great. All of us kind of approached it or saw it roughly at the same time. My first episode was also Deep Throat, but Jessica's got us beat, and so we'll defer to you on some of the other questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Good day.
To get back to the topic of this particular roundtable, is what we're wanting to kind of get at and to explore is, again, the international perspective, particularly because the X-Files, compared to a lot of other media at the time, is arguably fairly idiosyncratic. And it's also very centered into U.S. culture, U.S. politics. That's nothing new for a lot of U.S. media that's exported or media that's exported from any country. It often will be centered in there. For the X-Files, what we're looking to explore is how some of the things that are so internally focused, but also from a critique and from a global critique, were seen and reacted to in an international context. So what did your life experiences, your culture, your media landscape, what did that bring to your viewing experience and your interpretation of the text and your reinterpretation of the text? And then how it appealed to you and how it didn't appeal to you, and particularly how the X-Files is, compared to a lot of other media for the time, critical of certain aspects of U.S. society, and particularly the government and historical aspects, how that resonated. Did it feel authentic? Was there a level of crassness? Things like that. I'm just really interested to hear your experiences. So I'm going to start off here with the first question, and then feel free to take any directions that you want to explore this. So the first one is, how did your cultural context shape your perspectives of certain aspects of the show? And again, such as the distrust of the government. So not even necessarily the U.S. government. I mean, did you make or perceive analogs in the Australian or UK governments, or did you contextualize most things in the original U.S. context? And so I want to also extend that similarly for a sociological element, or the paranormal, etc. So any of those things that might have been centered, did you perceive them localized in your local environment or in the environment of origin? How did you relate to those?
So I kind of did a bit of both of what you're saying, both contextualising it in my local culture and projecting it back onto the US culture. So, Australia and America have a lot of cultural similarities. We're Western, democratic, capitalist countries. And so mostly I just did a mental mapping of the US elements or entities in the show onto their Australian counterparts. So, like the government or the military. So they were just subconsciously equated with the equivalent Australian entities. So that was a pretty easy merger to make. But of course, especially in the 90s, America was always just bigger and better. So if there were going to be UFOs or some global conspiracy, then probably it would be based in America. So there was definitely an American colouring of the way I viewed things. So yeah, it was both.
There's so much we could explore at what you're talking about, but to maybe start, when you talk about even the UFO angle, was there a culture in Australia at the time? Was there a spirit of UFO lore and research of its own that was distinct or an analog in media or not?
I think it's funny that I'm being asked these pop culture media questions because I am hopeless at all this stuff, so I don't feel like my answer will be representative. But my answer is I think there was, based on what I could see in bookshops and magazines. Definitely there was an interest in that, not just UFOs, but things that were unexplained. Probably a reaction to the hyper-rationalist 70s and 80s. I don't know, people realising that they couldn't explain everything, and there was a bit of a backlash. So yeah, I definitely saw that. There was a place, it was a fair way from us, but there's a famous UFO hotspot, or a couple of them actually, in the middle of Australia where it's very remote. And that's actually where I grew up. So I was a long way north away from metropolitan Australia. So my experience is a bit different. But definitely there was, a lot of interest in UFOs, I think.
Really interesting. And you just have to start a different podcast just to talk about your experience of growing up in remote Australia. Since you brought it up, I want to really emphasize it. Thank you for doing that, about talking about representation here, in the sense that this is an exercise of getting your perspective. I'm not asking any of you to speak on behalf historically of Australia or England or the larger UK by any means, but your perspective. And that's why I think it was great that we started off with the diary. Your perspective is your perspective, and that's a wonderful data point to really seize onto. As a small analog for my own personal experience with international culture and media and be able to find that analog in the 90s, I fell into and became a very big fan of Midnight Oil. And that was a major teaching point for me about Aboriginal rights in the United States, because we don't have anything similar to that. Maybe certain artists might talk about Indigenous or Aboriginal rights in the United States. I might have a song or two, but there was nothing so holistic and so intensely resonant, and that even though it was talking about something localized there, I could very clearly use it as a learning experience to recontextualize where I grew up. So that's maybe my analog, if that can make sense to this example here.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I can't believe that you loved and knew of Midnight Oil, the early 90s. That was really their heyday, and there was a lot of precedents being made in terms of Indigenous land rights around the same time. So there was that both things happening at the same time.
You say U.S. is bigger and better. I might say at the time we were louder. The United States was louder and more grotesque and more productive. And media...
I was going to say, where's this word coming into it?
Always louder, not just then.
We could make a whole other podcast critiquing U.S. foreign policy, and that goes back for 200 years, and I'd be loving to join that. But how many listeners can we alienate in one go? And I'll start maybe recontextualizing louder and instead saying culturally colonizing. Yeah. Is a better way that I want to word that. And that's another thing I wanted to explore this from your perspective, this cultural element that we think of as the Disneyfication of the world. Yeah. How the X-Files sort of railed against that in its own way too is another thing we could talk about, is this idea of the loss of the hidden wilds, even the psychological wilds, the spiritual wilds, in addition to the physical wilds. That also has this element that here the X-Files and other media and cultural forces from the United States in particular goes and colonizes. For example, the X-Files airing in Australia or England is taking a slot from another television show or another piece of media that could be filmed that is coming from that culture and is sustaining that culture. Similar to the idea of Canadian content, where they have to have that certain percentage. So I do welcome these critiques, and I am so rambling here and talking over your turns. Can you jump over to Cy for a moment, that we can come back in case Jessica wants to add any more?
Well, basically just all three countries, the UK, the US and Australia, all of us tend to mostly be the same when it comes to people's mistrust of said governments, in not only the conspiracies and things like that, but I mean, let's face it, no one trusts their government with anything really. Again, the hotbed of all of this type of activity tends to be in great sort of amounts from the US of A. But like Jessica said earlier, I think when all of this was sort of broadcast on TV back then, it just had an explosion of interest in all things of that type of nature. Paranormal publications were on the shelves and a myriad of other types of programming. But I think it just goes back to everyone's general mistrust of their own governments. I think that's just a universal thing for all three countries involved here, I think, let's be honest. But yeah, I mean, this just heightened it, and it was done in such a good way that it kind of piqued people's interest in it again. That's my take on it anyway.
It's a great take. And maybe to punt it back to Jessica again, once we were first talking about we're approaching the show, we all kind of watched it at a very young age. Sounds like similar. Can you think and recontextualize how you approach it now as a fan versus when you were younger? Do you think there's a big distinction, and in what ways?
I think there is a big distinction, but probably not in the context in which we're currently talking about it. So not in terms of the cultural or the sociological or even the paranormal, but just more to do with the way, for me, that I consume media generally has changed, and that naturally includes the X-Files.
Yeah, kind of similar thing to me as well. And not only with the advent of things like social media and things like that, with some people anyway, myself included, there tends to be on some levels, some kind of distrust using these types of things. You don't know what kind of data that they're taking from any of your accounts. You know, there's all these types of things that kind of make you think twice before using these types of things. I know I'm probably going off on a tangent here, but that's things that I'm sort of thinking of using it in today's kind of society, because obviously that's basically what people use on a daily basis these days. So, you know, if you don't start using these kinds of things, you can get very quickly left behind. If it wasn't for the facts that it was around in the first place, I wouldn't be on this podcast right now, because that's how I got connected with you guys in the first place. So, but it does. It's, you know, it's all part of this mistrust element that comes into it.
Yeah, and I think that takes it back to what you were just saying before, Russell, that yes, the X-Files was an American export that was filling a slot in foreign countries' TV lineup, but I, for one, was very thankful for that, because there is a lot about anything that comes from a country that has certain of that country's centric focus, but it was also dealing with themes that were very universal, just like Sai is saying. I think the distrust of government, the questioning of what everything all means and how it all fits together, what do people know, how do people know, they're all very universal questions, and that's, I think, why, or one of the reasons why it was so popular, and certainly why I don't mind that it appeared on my TV screen in Australia.
Now, we could make a joke about the next thing I'm going to state, which is related to the fact that most people in the U.S. are monolingual and generally monocultural and relatively ethnocentric and fairly bad at geography. The test scores show this. In general, let's just say I would never have learned Trunagini's name or even heard that story if it wasn't for Midnight Oil. So thinking about some of the obscure themes and references that the X-Files played with, themes related to particularly the U.S. government, thinking of a deeper fact that even a lot of U.S. people might not know about, did you find any elements of the show as a viewer difficult to parse because of that, or were you fairly comfortable and aware of certain things like the details related to Watergate, as an example, to the treatment of the indigenous population, and this MK Ultra, things like this that might be under the surface? I'm wondering, were they in the ether in your environment?
Yeah, I was going to clarify what you meant by ethnocentric things that we were trying to contextualize, but definitely I was aware of a lot of those things, not all of them, but I was aware enough of them to pick up when they were being referenced, and then I could learn more by paying attention. So I guess the answer is yes.
Yeah, for the most part, with most of these episodes that went out with relation to the conspiracy, etc., it did kind of educate me in some ways, because even though I had a long-term interest in that genre, most of it, you know, I still didn't know about, and it did educate me in some ways, really. In most cases, to the better, but in others, we all know that towards the end of the show, it kind of got too convoluted in its own mess, to be quite honest, when it comes to the conspiracy. But, you know, it's very difficult to keep it going for that length of time. But for the most part, it done it quite well, I think. It educated me anyway. I don't know about you guys, but it definitely educated me.
I think when it got lost in its own mess, as you say, later on, I think in a way that's kind of realistic. Yeah. I suspect that's how real conspiracies actually work, where the conspirators are fighting with each other as well as managing a conspiracy. But that's probably another topic.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
It is a good one.
What I wanted to say, it might be a slightly tenuous link, but in terms of conspiracy and that sort of thing, I grew up in, speaking of geography, so in the Northern Territory of Australia. So I grew up in Darwin, which is the capital city. So if you think of a map of Australia, it's sort of up the top in the middle, right, in the tropics. It's thousands of kilometres from any other urban area in the country. In the Northern Territory, a long way south of Darwin, to be fair, there is a joint US-Australian military base called Pine Gap. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Mm-hmm. No.
and they are very secretive. And so that was something as a Territorian that I was aware of, and that just provided even more context for, you know, the Ellen's Air Force Base in Deep Throat or the hidden UFO technology or anything like that. I mean, I thought about them hiding UFOs and I hadn't seen anything, but I'd certainly seen the secrecy around a real place. So this is one of those things that X-Files was so good at. They took elements of truth and then expanded on them in ways that may have been true or may not have been, but it helped contextualize it for me in that way as well.
Yeah.
Very interesting examples. I love it. You both use the words tangent and tenuous, and I'm going to criticize both of those. Well, unless they're used in a positive and not a pejorative sense, because that's exactly the kind of paths I want to explore, and feel free to go in any directions. And I'll just add, since I originally watched the show when I was very young, I didn't pick up on a lot of the themes or details, and it wasn't until revisiting it again when I was much older and listening to some people on the X-Cast, like some of Darren Mooney's discussion about Anasazi, for example, that it's made me stop and go, oh, there's a lot more going on in the show than I had originally thought. So a lot of it is an age issue, but it is still fun to see that as much of a pop sheen that the X-Files had at the time, there's so much going underneath, but it was still parsable just on that pop level and not too, if you pardon the pun, alienating for some people.
Yeah.
I wish at times it was a little bit more aggressive, but that's just because I'm that way now. I'm a curmudgeon. But I'm thankful for the depth of themes. All right, let's
I think we all are to a certain degree.
Yeah. But I want to transition to something that Jessica actually had some comments before when we were talking on Facebook about this. How did the X-Files compare to other media that you were consuming that was produced internally, like Australia or UK, in terms of themes, style, and content?
With regards to themes, I don't think prior to the early 90s, I don't think there was anything in primetime TV in the UK quite like this show, really.
The Prisoner?
Aside from The Prisoner, but then you're talking about almost 30-odd years.
That's true, yeah. I didn't see it in the US until the late 80s, so to me it was a more recent show.
Yeah. Was it 68 that aired, something like that?
Was it that old? Oh my gosh.
It's quite old.
Okay, sorry I brought that up.
No, that's okay. It's actually quite good, but no, I think getting back to the original question, I think it's unique in that way because I don't think at the time anyway there was anything else that was on that could challenge it in that kind of way. With what you mentioned with regards to platonic relationships, that was a pretty good thing. And the fact that you could have someone as close as Mulder and Scully and not, at that time anyway, actually make it more than anything other than platonic friendship. That had a major influence in some ways. But no, to be honest, when it comes to things that related to the unexplained or paranormal, I can't really think of anything around that time that was on. It was literally after that there was an explosion of all these other types of shows, both imported and homegrown stuff. But with regards to the style, you could tell that it was US based, obviously, because most of the settings that they were out to and most of the stories were based within the US anyway. The darkness of it all and how it was shot and how it was shown back then. Most shows of today are using the same kinds of, methods in order to get their message across. But it's a very difficult question, this one, isn't it, really? I can't really put my finger on it. Yeah, very difficult.
It shows me up for the obsessive file that I am, but I remember it like yesterday. The first time I saw it, and just touching on something you said there. So when I watched the pilot and I got to the motel scene and Scully started undressing, I just remember thinking, oh man, here we go. There's always got to be a scene like this. There's always got to be, a love interest scene. And it didn't go how I expected. And that I already loved it, but I loved it even more from that point. I think in general, it was completely different to anything I'd seen on TV before. It was reminiscent perhaps of some movies. And it was different for things we've all already touched on. So there was the theme and there was the style. It was very, very cinematic. It was very, very dark. And what I really liked about it was really rigorous and smart. So not in a not in a snarky, fast-talking, smart way, the way a lot of sitcoms, both in America and elsewhere, tend to be, but just scientifically smart, philosophically smart, just really engaged with these big questions of life. And I just loved that so much. And from the first couple of minutes, and I had never seen anything like that before because everything on TV was very soapy, or panel shows or that sort of just didn't appeal in the same way that this immediately did.
Yeah, there was very little in the way of competition with regards to the same type of content, really, was there, back on in the day. I did really like the ambiguous endings to most of the early type of episodes as well, which kind of kept it appealing for me.
Also very real.
Yeah,
the real world
absolutely.
doesn't always get wrapped up in with a nice, neat, tidy bow. That was smart too.
And like you mentioned as well with the platonic relationship, because I think if you start going down the moonlighting route and put these two in a relationship, well, it's kind of second to the show. You don't really... The whole point of the show is to do with the unexplained, the paranormal, the this, that and the other. You don't want to worry about where the next date's coming from, do you?
But do you know what makes it unique in another way is adding on top of that, it did still in the end appeal to a fan base for that reason, for having those elements of what is going on romantically. But it was doing both. I would argue that there were two phases of types of fan that shifted over at some point around the midpoint of the series, but it definitely was trying to cater to both around the middle of its run, which is quite unique in and of itself.
In the late 90s, when all the internet discussion groups were all up and running, that was one of the parts of the discussion, wasn't it? All the shipping.
Was it? I wasn't online, so I don't know.
I wasn't either, but because I subscribed to the official magazine back then, and they were going on about it left, right and centre. It was a big thing back then, almost as much as the discussion of the episodes themselves. But to me, like I said, that doesn't appeal to me. But if it gets people talking about the show, then I'm all for it. Just like in today's society with Facebook and things like that. It does get people talking, and that's the good thing about it. If we're still talking about it 30 years later, they're doing something right, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, we're all ultimately wanting to be entertained. We don't want it to be too heavy, unless perhaps you're me, because I don't mind that. But
I say you don't want it going down the moonlighting route. We all know how that went, and the show was just never the same again.
That actually kind of brought up a tangent, so thanks for bringing that up there, Si, because speaking of moonlighting and speaking of precursors, two shows that arguably had, I think, a big influence on allowing the X-Files on the air is Twin Peaks and Northern Exposure. Mm-hmm. And Northern Exposure in particular kind of wrestled with that moonlighting thing in a interesting way. Less successful in the first few seasons, but I think the end of all resolution was fairly interesting. Did you get either of those shows? Because I think both in production and the explorations of themes, particularly Northern Exposure, I think has quite a bit in common with the X-Files. I'm wondering if you saw those and how they may have influenced anything.
I believe we had both shows on Channel 4 over here, but I must confess I haven't seen either of them. That's not relevant.
That's relevant that you haven't seen them, though.
Yeah,
that's helpful.
Yeah.
So thank you. But we can table that. And then Jessica?
I loved Northern Exposure. I'd forgotten about it. I'd never made the connection with X-Files before. Twin Peaks, I don't remember seeing. Perhaps I was too young, but there's also the factor that because I was in a remote area, we only had one commercial TV channel and they could not show everything that the 5+ channels was showing down south, as we called it. So that could have been a factor too, but I definitely saw Northern Exposure, and it was a very intelligent show too. That's a good point. So that's one I missed when I was talking about the X-Files being different.
As a caveat, Marlene Stemme, who's often on the Xcast and does excellent work. I don't know if you ever read, but she did quite a few reviews in Set the Tape.
Yeah, I remember hearing about.
I've been trying to pressure her into starting a Northern Exposure podcast. Maybe you two could team up and I could just be a Patreon supporter to start.
I'd listen.
Yeah, I'd listen to. I was worried the way I run my mouth off, I'd get in a lot of trouble with some of the subjects that show dealt with. I gotta back up. Know what I can get away with. Jessica, actually, you just brought up that factoid, which makes a nice transition about a single commercial channel where you grew up. So you may not be able to answer this completely on the national landscape level, but what presence, if at all, did the show seem, again, to you, to have in the national landscape? And then secondarily, how did you first connect with other fans? And this could mean even, did you see it in magazines and TV guides or people at school or work talking about it? Or was it pretty much just you for a while in isolation?
It was pretty much just me. My friends at school liked it, but they didn't like it for the same reasons. They were, David Duchovny was hot, etc., etc. That was a lot of the talk that was going on. It did feel very isolating, but in a way, it was kind of my thing, and so I didn't mind. Definitely saw a lot of it in magazines, would buy every magazine that I could see that there was an article about X-Files in, and I knew it was getting big when I could no longer afford to buy all the magazines. Yeah, I was definitely aware of it in the national landscape. We had a lot of American TV, even though we have two national broadcasters who do an amazing job of making sure we have a lot of Australian content. But yeah, like I said, we had one national broadcast channel and one commercial channel, and that commercial channel was, at that point in time, a lot of American shows.
Sai, you mentioned that, I believe you said it was on BBC One. Is that what is correct? So how about you?
That's right.
How did it, I'm guessing since it was BBC One, it probably had a fairly established presence, but to you, how did it feel? And then how did you first connect with other fans or people that you knew that watched it?
Similar to Jessica, really, in that it was mostly a solitary thing to begin with. I did catch it initially on Sky One back in the day, and I did have a work colleague who I used to work with back then who started catching it on terrestrial TV back on either BBC Two or BBC One, because it wasn't originally on BBC One, it was originally on BBC Two, and they moved it to prime time later down the line. I do remember recording all of them on VHS, and because he didn't have Sky, I had to take in these videotapes for him to watch the latest episode, and we'd talk about it and chat about it each time we were in work and things like that. And of course back then, because the internet was in its infancy, you didn't get any instant spoilers like today, with smartphones and things like that. But yeah, everyone that knew me knew that I was absolutely potty on it. And it came to a point where, in a similar vein to Jessica, I was buying everything all and sundry that had the X-Files stamp on it, really. And it was almost an obsession. Again, it goes back to when it was moved to primetime TV, and it was then in everyone's psyche that you knew it had hit big time, and then people were starting to want to borrow my VHS cassettes, because obviously back then DVDs were in their infancy as well, so how all the technology changes over the years. But it was mostly a solitary love to begin with. That's pretty much it, really. Yeah.
Oh, it's great.
If I had been on the internet at that point in time, I could have made a lot of money from my VHS collection, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I remember back then as well when they were selling the they were selling the complete series per season, and they were retailing here at £79.99
Wow.
per box set.
Wow.
Now, if you think take into consideration what you get today for that, you probably get the entire series for that. As you were back then, you think, oh my god, this is amazing, let's go and spend my hard-earned money on one season. It was ridiculous.
So I didn't really answer the question about how I connected with other fans, and that's probably because I didn't really. So it was around season 3 when it was getting really big. I actually left home and moved thousands of kilometres across the country, and I didn't have a TV in my university or college room. So I really lost track of it. And then when I heard it was ending in the early 2000s, I went and bought the DVD box sets, which were then available, and watched all those. And then in 2014, again, came back to it because I had a child and I was up in the middle of the night and I had a smartphone. So I was looking at things and watching things in the middle of the night. And then I came across some podcasts, including Kamal Nanjiani's one and this one. And then at some point about a year ago, I finally joined social media and connected with some other fans. So it took me 27 years.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's pretty much the same as me. When I was hunting around for podcasts, I found this very podcast. And in the same vein as you, I joined Facebook literally just to get to be a patron for this show.
Oh, wow, I'm not the only one.
Yeah, here we are today. So it reignited my interest in it big time, especially when I binged it, from the first episode. And I'm still, to this day, going through it. I still haven't caught up. It is a great way to talk with other fans. It's fantastic. I love it. I really do.
If you were to write an episode of The X-Files that took place where you were or grew up, so either where you were when you watched The X-Files or where you grew up or even where you live now, what would it be like? So would there be different approaches to characterization? What would the plot outline be? And then what paranormal, conspiratorial, sociological, political aspects would be involved? So, for example, I could say, where I'm at, I'm going to deal with mining as like a theme and the exploitation of miners. And then I'm going to have the Wendigo or something like that. And maybe explore why.
Can we turn the question back on you, Russell?
Sure.
Because I've got absolutely no idea. I failed at art and creative writing.
Yeah, I've drew a blank on this one.
I'm not going to be so cruel as to ask you to give me a script outline, but it's more of in the sense as let's imagine the X-Files was created in your country. And so similar, the X-Files being a US-Canadian shared, but the show primarily takes place in the United States. Different episodes will deal with different regional folklore and different political and historical ideas and events and different social and cultural themes and structures and things like that. For example, the Rain King, where they set something in the Midwest in the U.S. and they have the dealing with farming. We're going to have a rom-com style that's representative of something about the space and the place and the time. One of my favorite X-Files episodes, and the reason I really, really fell in love with it when I was younger, is the episode Darkness Falls, which takes place maybe around 150 kilometers, to translate it, from where I grew up. And it was the first time on a television show, and this goes back to your other question, your idea there, Jessica. The first time on a television show, I had seen something that really felt like the Pacific Northwest. It felt real. Like I had seen shows that allegedly took place there, but it felt like it was filmed there. It felt like they got the atmosphere right. And then the fact that it dealt with logging, which was, again, the major industry of the tiny town I grew up in of around 1,700 people. I also was an arachnophobe and didn't like any sort of swarming insects. The episode was my psyche kind of put out onto film. So it's in that example, there is folklore. There are paranormal ideas, creatures, cultural things, historical things in each of your countries that would inform this. So you could think of like Glastonbury or the Uluru. Am I saying that correct?
Uluru.
Uluru. I put the stress on the wrong syllable. Thank you. There's that kind of an idea of you have things that have connections to the Aboriginal populations. Certain things would probably be very inappropriate, especially now, to utilize, but other things could be used in a way that would be interesting to tell a story about your place in space. And how would the X-Files, in sum, after that long explanation, how would the X-Files look if it was created in your country and they wrote an episode about where you were from, where you grew up? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, in a way.
It does.
It does. I would say from a UK perspective, I would say because we're pretty good at period dramas over here, and I tend to like the haunted house type of story. But again, it would have to be like a time travel element, more like a Doctor Who type back in time element, wouldn't it?
Or Triangle.
It wouldn't be along. Or yeah, that's true. If you use Triangle as a stepping stone in the same kind of vein, that type of story is appealing to me. I do like that because it's not a predictable plot. And it doesn't have a predictable ending as well. Trying to piece together all the elements for a decent story. I don't know. That's going to be the tricky part. But I think, yeah, from a period drama standpoint, I think it would work quite well here. Whether it's based in London, whether it's based... Because let's face it, most of these period dramas are based in London anyway, aren't they? When it comes to England. But that's my kind of vision of it. As far as a plot and an outline, I couldn't give it to you off the top of my head, really.
What would make it X-Files? What would the theme be? What would it...
Yeah.
Well, how would it be X-Files and state something about your country and your culture and your history in a way that a normal period haunted house story... Because they often deal with history and culture. I mean, it's one of my favorite genres of storytelling is ghost stories for that reason. They're loaded with themes. Yeah. But in particular, the way the X-Files tries to ground things might give you some other ways to explore that. And if you want to think about it for a moment, no pressure. And you also don't have to answer no pressure. This is just fun chat time and not a pop quiz. It's not graded.
It's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. Yeah, come back to me. I'll think about this. Come back to me on this.
For me, I think the answer is kind of two-pronged. So a lot of the elements of the show would look the same, which I guess is what you're getting at. The duo would stay the same. So you've still got that dynamic of believer and skeptic, which I think is the whole point of the show. And in a way, some of what they do would be hard to translate to Australia. So one of the things I was going to say earlier but didn't get to was one of the differences that was really noteworthy to me between Australia and the US in the 90s and now is the size and scale and number of scientific institutions. So Scully's forever going to Johns Hopkins, the Smithsonian, they go to NASA, they talk about MIT, you've got NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Authority, I think is the last one. So you've got all these scientific organisations that have a lot of expertise, have labs. We don't have that in Australia to the same degree, and for a scientist, that's really frustrating. So I'd have to come up with some way of incorporating that. But in terms of a specific topic, something that I think is really interesting, and it's interesting you brought up Uluru, Russell, is this idea of different cultures looking at reality in different ways. Now, that's really generalised. I guess something I'm thinking about in my head is a novel and a movie called Picnic at Hanging Rock. Have either of you ever seen or heard of that?
No, I don't.
I own it. Yeah, by Peter Weir.
Yeah, so it's either the first or one of Peter Weir's first movies that he made. But the book was published without the final chapter, and there is a final chapter that was written. And it's all... So the general plot of this thing is that in 1900, girls go for a walk at this place called Hanging Rock. 4 of them disappear. 1 is eventually found a week later. They never find the other 3. No one knows what happens. When you read the final chapter, it's all this very non-linear, indigenous, different concept of time existing all at once rather than in this, then this, then this fashion. And so they've almost gone on to a different plane. And I've never fully understood it, but it's, to me, really stands out as an example of how different cultures look at the same thing differently. And out of that came this really fascinating story. So I'm thinking along those themes, someone who was more culturally literate than me would come up with something that investigated and explored that different way of looking at country and relation to place and time to our current Western society.
That sounds really good.
That feels like a really vague answer to me, but that's the best I can do.
That's pretty good.
It's a great answer. It makes me think about with the Uluru example. Imagine that be the Hanging Rock, and you're talking about different senses of place and time, and the X-Files might... and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but might look at the struggle, the thematic political struggle of ownership and heritage and names. Mm-hmm. Uluru being an example of something that has intense representative power in the colonial context, and the symbolic gesture of the government returning it and restoring it to the Aboriginal people. That has a lot of analog with some of the stories in the X-Files as well.
I'm impressed you've heard about that.
It's Midnight Oil. They brainwashed me. The other thing on that level, and I do want to get back to you, Si, because I definitely want to hear more of your stuff, was excited to talk about when you agreed to come on as the Australian analog. As somebody who grew up in a little bit more of a remote area, the X-Files again played with this disconnect between the wilds and the unknown and the disappearance of that. And Australia, as an outsider, it has this extreme reputation. To me, my understanding conceptually, especially in the past, was a really intense divide between the outback and the populous coastal areas. That there is this sense of space that I don't know if it exists, especially in that circular sense, anywhere else in the world to that degree. I mean, there are other large deserts and things, but it doesn't have the same resonance. And I think there's so much that could be explored in an X-Files made in Australia, just working with all of that and the colonial history and et cetera.
Yeah, I think that impression you have of the divide between not so much the outback, I'd say, but just the country or the bush and the urban areas.
The bush. Still, that's the short word I should use. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, it's all good. Very much alive and well. And I guess the counterparts I can think of in the US is like the Northeast and the North compared to the South. But yeah, I'm not very familiar, but there is that big divide, definitely, still.
I don't know if you ever saw the film. I think it's The Long Weekend, the 70s film.
No, I haven't.
No, I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it, no.
It's often considered an Ozploitation film. I don't really consider it that way. I think it's a little bit more in line with like a Peter Weir film. It's a little more schlocky horror in some elements, but it deals with a couple going out to a remote area and going camping, and they're going through some complicated relationship stuff. And metaphorically, nature is reacting to how the relationship is reacting, and then also dealing again with some of the stuff talking about with encroaching industry and things like that in nature's place. And I've seen it maybe only 3 or 4 times, but when I do go, oh, this would make a really good X-Files episode. Has partially inspired some of this.
You just freaked me out completely because you reminded me of... I don't want to bring it up. I'm not going to say names, but there's been a couple of cases where there's been high-profile disappearances or murders in the middle of nowhere in Australia. And part of the reason that they're still mysteries is because it is so incredibly isolated. It's like a real-life Roadrunners from season 8 where...
Wow, blimey.
There's no information to try and figure out what happened. And as someone who spent a lot of time on remote roads and used to enjoy it, now I'm always a bit terrified especially at night. So there's an X-File.
And not a pleasant one. Yeah, when it goes to Roadrunners, there goes dinner. And your soul. Oh.
Do you know what? I haven't actually come up with I still haven't come up with a plot.
Yeah, you don't need to. No worries. You don't have to come up with a plot. But can you think of a political event or a historical event, recent, like when the X-Files were around, or maybe going back to the 60s or 70s, like perhaps Margaret Thatcher was a grey alien?
Either that or grey alien. That'd be an X-File in itself, wouldn't it, really? It would probably be better centred around World War II, I would think. I mean, I know I said about period drama, but it's still kind of along the same element. And hopefully, if it were to ever come to fruition, they wouldn't have too many Americans trying to do a Dick Van Dyke accent for us English or British people. But I think I'm going to have to pass on that. I can't really think of anything else to bring to the story, unfortunately.
No problem. We've explored a lot of things. Are there any other tangents that you want to touch on before we wrap things up?
I feel like we didn't get to, when we were talking initially about how does your cultural context shape your perspective of certain aspects of the show. We talked a lot about cultural and sociological, and we didn't really get to the paranormal. And I think there's some interesting stuff to talk about there.
That sounds great. I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah.
The way that our cultural context shapes the perspective of the way we watch the X-Files, I think is probably stronger than perhaps we realise. So we were saying before, we all are very much part of and grew up in industrialised Western democratic nations. And we're very much a product of the Enlightenment, and we try to rationalise everything, and we think eventually rationalising and reason will explain everything. And the X-Files still really piques our interest because it says, well, maybe it doesn't. And even though we have these beliefs that everything can be rationalized, we're still fascinated by the concept that perhaps it can't. So it's almost like our subconscious is disagreeing with our conscious. And I've heard a number of things over the years. So there's, I apologise, I know I'm going to say her name wrong, but Avi Kuyar, who worked a lot writing official stuff for the X-Files, and she was interviewed on the X-Files Diaries podcast last year or the year before. And she was talking about in her culture where she grew up in Venezuela, the paranormal was just part of their everyday experience. Her brother practiced voodoo. She grew up a Catholic. This idea that there was this world beyond was very normal for her. And I've heard other people say similar things. So I think whereas for us in Western nations, the X-Files opened our eyes up to these less rationalist way of looking at things. For some people, they were probably looking at the paranormal and saying, perhaps we can look at it more rationally, because they would be looking at Scully as the unusual one. So I think that really shapes the way we watch it, perhaps without us even realising it a lot of the time. Just to go off on another tangent, there's an author who I really appreciate, and he tells this story of one day how he was talking to a colleague who happened to be black, and this colleague said, "Do you know what's so annoying about white people? They think they don't have a culture." And this author says that he responded, "What do you mean?" And then realised that he completely shot himself in the foot, because that's exactly the point. I think we tend to think that the way we look at things is just the way things are. And I love that the X-Files took that and played with that and said, well, maybe not.
I'll just put this over to you, Jessica. Was there any kind of conventions run back then when the show was still on over in Australia? Because the thing I find most strange from a UK perspective is that back when it was still airing during the 90s, the lack of UK-based conventions here. I mean, there were a few, but I never got to any. I was just interested to know if you had any.
I'm laughing silently because I have no idea.
No?
And I don't think this is peculiar to me. I've heard other people say the same thing. I don't know if I would go.
Yeah.
I love the show and I love the characters and I love the stories. That doesn't extend to wanting to go to an exhibition or a con and see the actors, if that makes sense.
Are you not comfortable around gatherings or things like that, or is it just because that type of thing doesn't appeal to you?
Both. I'm not comfortable in groups of people. Because
initially that's how I felt.
Yeah, right.
And then over the last, I would say about 10, 15 years or so, I go to so many conventions, it's embarrassing. But
is this just for X-Files or other shows as well?
Other shows as well, because...
Okay.
Because of the lack of stuff that's related to the X-Files. It's strange, really, that there's not a lot more out there X-Files related. There are two that are coming over here, I believe, in November in Cardiff. Mitch Pileggi and Annabeth Gish are over. But again, it depends if it's your thing. If it's not your thing, then obviously, it doesn't appeal to you, really. But for me, I mean, depending on how these things are run, I mean, if you go into big events like the major Comic Cons in London, Birmingham, Cardiff and things like that over here, they tend to be more money based. They're not kind of intimate like the other shows that I attend, for Doctor Who's and things like that.
Yeah. Where
you actually get to engage with a guest and get your picture taken with them or whatever. But I was just interested to know whether that was the same over there, but obviously it's not.
Yeah, well, I have to admit I wouldn't know, even if there was. No. And maybe if I had the opportunity, I would consider it, but it's not something I've ever really considered.
You brought up something really interesting, Jessica, that I wanted to touch back on. And at first, you may have talked about this before, and I've forgotten because I have a poor memory. You just mentioned, it sounds like you work in science?
Correct, yeah.
What kind of work do you do, just to kind of give a little bit of background?
I'm a meteorologist, so I guess most people know that's weather forecasting, assessing weather data, weather forecasting. I did used to work in climatology and before that in physics labs, but that was a long time ago now.
That's awesome. And the reason I want to ask is it's the obvious question. Was there a Scully effect at play by any chance? And even if not Scully in particular, what drew you into science?
Because I could never stop asking questions and because I wanted there to be black and white answers. And ironically enough, science eventually led me to the point of realization that even science doesn't offer that. But it does provide a rational way of interrogating the world. And to get back to Scully effect question, no, in a way, because I already was obsessed. But it was so fantastic to have that role model on TV, which I hadn't seen before, and particularly when I felt like the lone nerd at school, the only girl who watched Star Wars and that sort of thing. So it was very affirming, even if it didn't necessarily change the course.
That's wonderful. Again, it plays into the X-Files story you're talking about of reason and exploration and the ability to continue to open up beyond that, understand the limitations of certain modalities. But the real thing I wanted to get back to that you brought up was talking about the existence of a self-establishing default culture that's in the West. We could make a whole other podcast about this, which we don't need to go into necessarily, but I'm just going to comment it on here. The X-Files has a problematic history when it comes to representing non-Western cultures. And it also has a problem representing some Western cultures into some degree. For example, Signs and Wonders or Thief, something like that. But there's class issues, there's all of these other things at play. It is interesting, the comments you were making, Jessica, I really appreciated them talking about the aspect of science and technocracy, you know, in its rationalist worldview. And I was just having a discussion on Discord in the We Made This network, because I started reading a book called American Cosmic by D.W. Pasulka. Are you familiar with this?
No, I'm not actually.
Yeah, I just heard an interview with her on another podcast, and I checked it up, and I think it kind of touches on some of this. She is a professor of religion, and she went around to UFO conventions and meeting with UFO researchers. I'm only about halfway through the book, so I can't talk about where it's going to end up, but the basic theme that's being pulled out of here is that UFO culture has become a religion for, in particular, Silicon Valley, and that a lot of funding for UFO research is coming from Silicon Valley, and that there are all these different interesting connections between traditional, particularly like Protestant or Catholic religion and practices with the new UFO religion.
What an interesting connection. I've written that book down.
It's a popular written book. It's not a real traditionally written like academic work, but it is still there. It's an interesting book so far. And if nothing else, I recommend listening to some of the interviews she's done that are really, really engaging, and was really impressed with some of the stuff she had to say.
It's just reminded me though, did you read the article in the New Yorker about, so it's 5 years ago, the nostalgic science fiction of the X-Files? Have you read that?
No.
Okay, there's a paragraph at the end which is really relevant to what you're saying, Russell. So he's talking about one of the appeals of X-Files being a retrofuturism. So as opposed to futurism anticipating how science will change the future, retrofuturism is the remembering of that anticipation. And it talks at the end, it says, this is quoting, "Week by week, the show weighed the question of whether an old vision of the future, a vision organised around the biological transformative power of technology, was preferable to the vision of the future that was at the time emerging, a vision in which our minds and personalities would be transformed inwardly by technologies of information." So I was just thinking of that when you were talking.
Wow, how did you pull that out so quick? That's exceptional. I'm going to have to read that article.
I am surrounded by articles with lots of highlighting.
Any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
No, yeah, that's pretty much it from me. The only other thing I was going to say was when the series was brought back in 2016 and 2018, do you think it was properly modernised to today's society? Okay the way it was? Do you think it needed any improvements? I personally think it was okay, but...
That's a huge question, Si.
That's a whole other podcast. But we can do a quick speed round.
But what do you think, when it was brought back then, and the society we're living in, both then and now, has it been brought to the fore? Is it okay the way it was, or...?
I think it did some things really well and perhaps some other things not so well, but it's very hard to compare them because I think I mentioned earlier the way I watch the show is quite different to what it was. So I'm much more aware of the cultural dominance of America, for example, now than I was in the early 90s. And the other thing that's really changed that has been talked about a lot is that conspiracy culture has become mainstream. So the Mulders of the world are the dangerous people, not the heroes. So I think they explored that in some good ways in the revival. And I can't really talk in detail because I haven't watched it recently. No. But yeah, I think they acknowledged that and they addressed that at least in some fashion. So I thought that was fairly astute.
I want to thank you all very much for taking the time. I had so much fun. I hope we can talk again.
Me too.
I also want to pass on the invitation to listeners to share your thoughts about some of the topics we discussed in the comments. And if you are from a different country or region and a patron and might be interested in talking about this from your own context, for example, Jessica mentioned the other X-Files fan from Venezuela. It'd be wonderful to get a perspective from South America or Africa or East Asia, anywhere. Just if you are in any different country, be interested in sharing your perspectives, please reach out to me and we might be able to have another roundtable and explore some of these ideas to get a broader perspective. Really appreciate both of you again for taking the time and sharing all that you did.
Thank you. No problem.
Thank you for hosting. I'm glad the roundtables are still happening.
It's a treat, absolute treat. Where can folks find you and what are you up to?
I'm not up to much, really. I'm in the basement these days. I'm also on Twitter, but I more lurk and like rather than tweet much, but I'm at JT Miske, so JTMISKE.
Yeah, I'm in the basement as well as Cy James, and if you ever wanted to contact me via email, it's shodgson73@msn.com. But other than that, I don't really lurk anywhere else. So
awesome.
Brilliant.
Thank you all once again, and until next time, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This.
The giddy carousel of pop.
I became really obsessed with music. It's sort of 1982. Fell in love with Simon Le Bon. There was a rumour in Australia, and I don't know if it existed anywhere else, and I've never been able to find verification of it on the internet, that he was the son of Brian Ferry. That was the rumour in Australia. Yes, seriously, and everyone believed it. Everyone believed it. I remember the first time I saw Planet Earth and my sister saying, oh, well, he's Brian Ferry's son. And I was like, oh, okay, that's good.
The TARDIS crew.
It's got a real strong magic there, you know, the supernatural mystery, the supernatural Christmas ghost story kind of really comes together, and I think that's what works for me.
And it's also probably the first classic of McGann as the Doctor, because before this you had the TV movie, which isn't fondly liked, if we're being honest, and then all the stories with him in Big Finish that preceded this, none are marked down as you must listen to this, but arguably The Chimes of Midnight is the first story where you see McGann and go, yes, he is 100% the Doctor.
Pick a disc.
And then the Martians...
Which would do
yeah.
it.
And then the Martians construct a machine, which is like a spider-like vehicle to try and capture and collect humans and to harvest them.
When they're seen injecting the blood of the humans into their veins.
Yes.
Which is pretty badass.
How old were you when you were listening to this?
I think I was probably 3 or 4 when I was first listening to
this. This explains a lot. Because it's quite it's like kind of gruesome body horror, but without the visuals when you think about it, isn't it? So it's
so you're using your imagination, so it's even better.
So
check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The Xcast and X-Files podcast was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the Xcast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.